Welcome to the Book Faire podcast. My name is Anthony, and this week we have an interview with author Joan Reardon. We also have a brief look at some new releases in literature for young audiences, as well as the latest effort in book bans that has 17 states coming together against the freedom to read. Let's begin first with an interview with Joan Reardon, author of the middle grade novel Dad Rock Dragon Quest. Good afternoon, Joan Reardon. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Can you start us off by introducing yourself to the audience and the book that we'll be discussing today?
Of course. My name is Joan Reardon. I am a middle grade author. I am also a full-time attorney. As an attorney, I practice under the name Joan Stebelton. I'm with Retzel and Andrus LPA, which is a national law firm. The book we're discussing today is my second middle grade novel, Dad Rock Dragon Quest. It follows the story of 12-year-old Zadie Drake, who is an aspiring rock star, whose family has recently fallen under hard emotional times. Her parents are divorced. Her mom has recently started dating again, a man named Lloyd Clutterbuck, who is the exact opposite of Zadie. He's a boring risk analyst with a aversion to anything fun, so to speak. Her father lives in Virginia. He's constantly traveling for work, and she very rarely gets to see him. So when she gets the opportunity to hang out with her father over the summer and visit him with her sister, she wants to jump at the chance. Her mom adds the condition that her new boyfriend, Lloyd, must go with them because, dad has a tendency to be irresponsible. So when Zadie, Lloyd, and her sister get there, they do find out that the dad is actually a protector of magical creatures. He's called a game warden. And when his pet dragon is kidnapped by magical poachers, they all have to go on a cross-country road trip to rescue the dragon. So yeah, that kind of sums it up.
And could you talk a little bit about Zadie's sister? I feel like in that synopsis, he didn't really go into who she was.
Fair enough. Yeah. So Zadie's sister Persephone is an eco-warrior. She is a teenager that has a podcast that is like all things environmental. She's very passionate. She's very much a protector of the family. Unlike Zadie, she has a very strained relationship with her father, whereas Zadie is sometimes willing to deal with his shortcomings. Persephone is not as much willing to do so. So Zadie, just because she's so similar to the dad and that they have, very similar personalities, they both love rock and roll. They're both very adventurous, both very outgoing. Persephone, in kind of a classic older sibling fashion, is a bit more responsible and is not as huge of a fan as the dad. So.
And Zadie's closeness with their dad, while Persephone has a little bit of tension between him and her, does that cause any kind of clashing or fighting between Zadie and Persephone?
I guess it causes like a little bit of disagreements, especially like early on where, Persephone being like an ecology girl is very much willing to go visit the dad because the dad lives in a national park. But she definitely wants the mom's boyfriend to go along. She prefers the mom's boyfriend to dad any day of the week just because he's more responsible and is like more of a classic dad figure. Whereas Zadie would, much rather not have him along to spoil all the fun. So yeah, it does cause some tension between the two sisters, especially as they deal with it in like the first act of the book. But as they, grow in the story and come to understand the dad and Lloyd a little bit more, the family does come together a little bit towards the end.
A lot of books written for younger audiences will sometimes play into real themes of hard times that children will go through. And a lot of times that can include things like the loss of a parent or divorce. How did you approach writing this family that is seen after the separation and seeing once that the families have kind of settled away from each other?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I set out to write this book, I was thinking about when I read middle grade books as a kid, in my interpretation, like when I was reading like Percy Jackson, Harry Potter, those sorts of stories, the parents in middle grade books that I read were always either perfect, absent, or dead. They just had kind of like no involvement in the story. And I think it's important for kids to realize that their parents are people as well. They're just as complex as they are. Most parents are just people trying their best. They're trying to make the best decisions for their family, for their children. And, sometimes parents make mistakes the same way that kids do. So I kind of wanted to introduce parents that went on the adventures with the kids and were also struggling to make the right decisions, which is how I got, into the situation where there is Damien, the dad, Lloyd, and the mom, who are all struggling to make the correct decisions for Zadie and Persephone, the children. Not saying that they necessarily make any right or wrong decisions. They're making the decisions that are just best for their family or what they perceive to be the best for their family. We learn a little bit more about their upbringing throughout the book. Damien and Freya, the mom and the dad, both grew up as game wardens. When they had Zadie and Persephone, they made the decision that they would not raise their children as game wardens, which is more Freya's decision than Damien's, which caused a lot of tension in the relationship. And then we later find out, when everything happens, that it was kind of all for naught because Zadie and Persephone end up like going down the game warden path anyway. So it feels more real to have parents that are struggling making the correct decisions, that are trying their best, that sometimes make mistakes. So I guess I just wanted to have an adventure where the parents are there with the kids and it's just a family trying their best.
And with Damien and Freya's separation, it kind of stems from a disagreement in how to raise the children. Is that something that you have experience with? Do you have any insight into this information? Not to get like super personal, obviously.
No, it's kind of crazy actually. No, my parents are, very much lovebirds, like even to this day. So I come from like, a very steady home life just growing up. But like any family, we've had our disagreements. And I guess like even when I was like reading books as kids, like I would read these stories and be like, there was no way my parents would let me do this adventure on my own. And whenever like even when we go on family trips, there would be like arguments and like that sort of stuff, just like anything you'd get with an average family. So I feel like in terms of like family struggles, like any family is going to struggle with like a dynamic, and especially when you put everybody like in an intense situation, like is in this book, there's going to be disagreements amongst the family. So that's just kind of what's reflected there. But yeah, it doesn't really necessarily come from any personal experience with my family. Like I haven't personally experienced growing up in a divorced household, but I have experienced, having disagreements with family members when we're both like everyone in the party is like 150% convinced that they're right. Whether or not that's true, I come from a very opinionated line of people. So, but the important thing is that everybody loves each other and is constantly trying their best.
One of the biggest things in middle grade fiction and any books that target young audiences is giving the main characters, who are typically younger people, a sense of agency and control in the story. Was there any trouble with continuing to give that agency to Zadie and also to Persephone while keeping the adults so heavily present throughout the adventure?
Yes. Yeah. So in the early drafting of the book, I did worry about the idea of giving Zadie and Persephone agency. And I feel like making them both very, very rebellious as far as kids go did help out with that, where they are not the kind of kids that are just going to say yes to authority figures, or there's always going to be like that inherent level of pushback with them as characters, just like as who they are. And I feel like part of it is like Damien is more the dad is more of like a fun uncle, and his energy that he brings to the table in terms of parenting, where he doesn't necessarily always make the safest decisions. He's always about like taking risks, doing, a million different things, just like whatever you think would be the most fun thing is what Damien wants to do. So I think in like one of the earlier chapters, like he brings a coyote to, career day. When Zadie's in kindergarten, that's like one of the lines that he crossed with the mom before they got divorced. So he's just kind of like a very, very outgoing, risk taking figure who wants to seem cool to the children, and who Zadie thinks is very cool. So sometimes it's like Zadie and her dad are teaming up against Lloyd. Sometimes it's like Lloyd and Persephone are teaming up against the others. So I think having them all be very opinionated and very rebellious and very set in their ways helped with giving the characters agency.
And did the idea of rock and roll and music playing such a heavy inspiration, did that come early on in the story outline?
Yeah, so this is actually a really fun fact about the book. Both Damien and Lloyd are based on my husband. I started writing this book when we were first engaged, and I was just trying to find like a fun story that we would hopefully read to our children and grandchildren one day that was just based on everything that my husband loved. So, one character is my husband's left brain, like his creative side, which would be Damien, and then the other is his right brain, like that super analytical side, which is Lloyd. So yeah, Lloyd drives the Subaru, which is my husband's car. Damien's very much into rock and roll, which is Ben's favorite genre of music and also my favorite genre of music. So it's just kind of like the two sides of my husband who I love very dearly. So yeah, that's kind of where that rock and roll element came from, is just, Ben and I are constantly listening to rock music. Anyone who will read the book, like each chapter is a different rock and roll song, which makes a playlist, which is available on my Spotify, which is also Writing Reardon. So you can listen to it as you read along. There is a ton of Led Zeppelin in it, and I do apologize to anyone who is not a Led Zeppelin fan, but that is our go-to band.
With Damien being so heavily inspired by your husband, and it seems like he was one of the first characters. Was he one of the first characters that was being created in the writing process?
Yeah, so the first character I made was Zadie, and it was just sort of thinking about, the kind of kid that Ben and I might have one day, just like someone who's like extremely rebellious, like into rock and roll music, into mythology, which is like where a little bit of the Joan comes through. Uh, and then everything just sort of sprang around that because, I did want to write a book that included parents as part of the adventure. And then, Damien and Lloyd, just as like the two sides of Ben came in, and then I made Freya, and it just sort of sprang from there. Persephone was a little bit harder to nail down. I think I went through like 3 or 4 versions of Persephone before I finally landed on like the Eco Warrior podcast girl. Originally, she was like very, very straight laced, like straight A's type kid, and then I was like, that just would not be the sort of kid that Damien and Freya would raise. So I had to change her up a little bit, and I'm very satisfied with the version of Persephone it landed on.
And with the family being non-traditional, having the parents being divorced, to any young readers who may be growing up in a similar situation or who see themselves reflected in these children, are there any messages of are there any messages that you wish to impart to the readers through the story?
Yeah, so the main theme of the story, I think, is just trying to grapple with understanding that your parents are people too. And just because they no longer are in love with each other doesn't mean that they don't love you, and that it's worth like there's never any limit to the love that you can have as a person. You can be loved by multiple people in multiple different ways. It doesn't necessarily negate the love that someone else feels for you. So if your parents, a parent's dating someone else, it doesn't negate the love that you have for that other parent. No one's being replaced. It's just sort of expanding what it means to be a family.
And does Zadie go through that struggle of seeing? Are there any cracks in in that relationship with her dad that come about through the story?
Right, yeah. So I feel like as the story continues, especially throughout the second and the third act, as she gets to know, like, go on these sort of game worn adventures with Damien, as they're like encountering these magical creatures, as they're fighting poachers, she starts to realize that dad sometimes takes a little bit too much risk. He doesn't really take care of himself in the way that he's supposed to. Sometimes he'll like put the kids in the line of fire in a way that's not super safe. Whereas Lloyd is constantly like, he's very, very anxious. Lloyd is a character. Like, he wants everything to be like, there's step 1 through 2, 3, 4. Like, we're just going down methodically through it. And so she really struggles with Lloyd because they're so different as characters. But then she realizes as the book goes on, is like, that's just his way of showing that he cares, is by like making sure she's taken care of and making sure all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted. So it's just like this coming to understand these two figures in her life and like their complexities. And it doesn't mean that, there's any lack of love there. It's just that they're just as complex as she is as a person.
And she is also seeing that neither of these characters is wholly perfect. And so, what does she learn to kind of bring into that familial relationship at the end of the story? Is there anything that she takes away that she realizes that she needs to do to help these relationships continue to be to continue to grow and be strong?
Yep. So with Lloyd especially is where Zadie struggles in her relationships. With Lloyd, she learns that it's usually about meeting in the middle, and that liking Lloyd doesn't mean her love for dad is diminished any less. So Zadie and Lloyd learn to understand each other a little bit more. They learn to listen, which is extremely important, and just kind of take an interest in each other's hobbies and the things that the other person cares about. Because if you care about someone and something matters to them, then you should take an interest in that. So I feel like learning to meet in the middle is kind of important for a lot of the figures in the book, and I feel like Persephone learns to do the same with Damien, or more so, Damien learns to do the same thing with Persephone as the story continues. Is just learning to be because as the story continues, Damien realizes, like, I've been a little selfish. Like, I haven't been there for the kids as I should have been, just because like he's prioritized being a game warden over being a father. And he realizes like you can be both things simultaneously and just like not detract from the other.
And now changing gears a little bit to more about writing as a whole, as opposed to just this book in particular.
Mhm.
When you reached out for this, one of the things you mentioned was that you wrote your first book while you were attending college. Would you like to talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So my first book, The Grimsby Family Witch Hunters, I actually wrote while I was attending college during COVID. So I wrote that in the spring of 2020, and I queried it while I was in law school. So I'm also, as all that was going on, it was just kind of struggling to balance the two. And then I wrote the entirety of Dad Rock Dragon Quest while I was attending law school. I did a lot of the edits on the Grimsbanes while I was taking the bar exam, and then during my first year of practice was when I was doing all of the edits on Dad Rock Dragon Quest. So yeah, it is kind of like a Hannah Montana double lifestyle where by day I am practicing law and by night I am writing, which is extremely fun. But during school, there were some difficulties at first, and I was just trying to figure out like how to balance it. Like I'm obviously very, very dedicated to legal practice, and I was dedicated to my schoolwork. But I was also extremely passionate about writing. And so I didn't want to sacrifice either of my passions for the sake of the other. So between classes, once I had finished all of my reading for law school, I would go to the cafe next door to my law school, and that's where I drafted the entirety of Dad Rock Dragon Quest. Was just between classes during law school, which is a really interesting experience. Just to do that. And then additionally, like as I was starting practice, when there was no longer like that necessarily set 9 to 5, where there was like demands after work, editing Dad Rock Dragon Quest, which was also interesting, was just like finding ways to like balance those two facets of my life.
Was there a set goal for a number of pages, a number of paragraphs, chapters, words, whatever, to write each day, or were you just trying to get any progress done?
I always just try to get any progress done. There are some authors who tell you need to write every day. I don't think that's necessarily true, and it's certainly not true in my experience. There are certain lifestyles that allow like certain times of day, like you can commit to writing. In certain demanding fields, that's just not going to be the reality. So there are going to be months where I write nothing. There are months where I write an entire book. It just kind of just depends on how the schedule goes and how demanding everything outside of writing life is, and how demanding outside of lawyer life is. Uh, there have been days where I've sat down and wrote 8,000 words. There have been days where I've sat down and wrote 250 words. The important thing is that words get on the page. It's just kind of the way I view it. So, and I feel like there's always this intense sense of guilt when authors try to set like a certain schedule where it's like, okay, I'm going to write 2 pages a day. And then if you don't hit that 2 pages because of other things going on, then there's like, oh, I missed it. Oh, I feel guilty. Oh, aren't I terrible because I didn't get my 2 pages in? I feel like authors need to be a little kinder to themselves and recognize that sometimes life can be demanding. It doesn't necessarily mean that your passion is falling to the wayside just because you miss a day that you required yourself to write. So if you do set a schedule, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. I just advise anyone that's no matter what you're writing to be kind to yourself and to your word count, because everything will get on the page eventually.
Even without a strict structure or goal in mind, did you ever feel like you were not personally living up to your own expectations? Was there any time where you felt you were struggling to actually get the writing done, or did you feel that there was a confidence that you were going to get it in your own time?
Oh no, I've struggled, trying to get writing done, especially when I was taking the bar exam. So this was in 2023. Um, the bar exam is like a very difficult experience for anyone who's a lawyer will tell you. Like bar exam is just like awful, 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 and it gets hyped up all throughout law school. It's just wait until you take the bar exam, and there's so much riding on it. And oftentimes, your job offer is dependent on whether you pass the bar exam. So there's a lot riding on it. So doing that simultaneously with doing edits was a little stressful. It's just trying to get everything in simultaneously and trying to balance everything. Um, so yeah, when I was doing my edits, like the bar exam, like I took a little bit of a pause for like a couple days and was just like, I need to focus on the edits right now. And then I just jumped right back and I was like, the bar exam will be there, when I get back. And it is healthy sometimes to take a break from that. So you just take a weekend. And then I did all my edits. I stayed up late to get them done. And then I was able to jump right back in the bar exam. And I passed with flying colors, I'm happy to say. So, it just kind of depends. Like, it's important to just know how to balance your schedule, and just do what's right for you. And I feel like oftentimes, like editors and agents even are just very understanding when you do reach out to them and say, like, hey, I need an extension on something because, everyone's it can be intimidating, but people are people. Everyone goes through things in life, and if anything's ever going on, I feel like people are understanding. But I try as hard as I can usually to stick to like a schedule. So if I get a deadline, I like to hit the deadline. That's more me as a person, just because I'm competitive with myself.
And if you were to say to give a single piece of advice to someone who may be looking for that first baby step on how to start balancing their schedule, just has a difficulty with sticking to a schedule and with the discipline in doing that, what piece of advice would you give as the first baby step towards developing a schedule?
Absolutely. So I have two pieces of advice. Uh, Both hinge on the fact that psychology is extremely important when you're considering these issues. First, you're going to need a writing buddy, someone who's going to hold you accountable no matter what. When they say, like, hey, this is what I'm drafting, what are you drafting? Are you struggling with anything? It's important to be able to talk to someone about what you're going through. Say that you have extreme writer's block. I think it's important to be able to bounce those ideas off of someone. For me, that person's usually either going to be my husband or my mother in law, who is also an author. She's not published, but she does write. So, yeah, sometimes my mother-in-law and I will just, I'm saying like, hey, I need to get all this writing done. She says, great, let's go meet up at a cafe and we'll just sit there all day and write, So that'll usually be on a weekend, of course. The second bit actually does go into that. I think it's important to designate spaces in your life. So I try not to write, where I would study in law school, right? So I would go to the cafe next to the law school, and that would just be exclusively my writing place, which would get me in the mindset like, hey, it's time to write. Now, I work at my office at home. Sometimes I work, but whenever I'm like really doing intense writing, I usually will go to like a third location, whether it be like my in law's house or my parents' house or like a cafe, and I'll write there just because I think it gets you in the mindset of writing. For people that like really aren't into like writing in public places, some other things you could do is if like there's like a certain scented candle you have, you can light that before you start writing because that'll psychologically trigger like, hey, it's time to get into the creative mindset and it's time to start writing, and blow it out as soon as you finish so the scent doesn't linger if you're moving on to other tasks. Having a certain snack, even like using a certain brand of like scented hand sanitizer can help with that sort of thing.
It's funny because of you mentioned like having a buddy, because just last week I was in finals for the first week of summer classes, for the first half of summer
Mhm.
classes. And while driving home on Wednesday in the middle of the night from our work, I said to my wife, I just don't think I'm going to get a podcast up this week because there's no time. And she said, well,
Mhm.
don't you have like didn't you interview somebody for it? I was like, no, there's just a gap. And she said, you want to interview me? And I was like, all right. And so, so I interviewed my wife for the episode that came out last week, and I wouldn't have done an episode at all if it wasn't for her.
Yeah, it's really important to like rely on the people in your life, whether it be like spouses, family members, friends, like found family, just people that like, are going to be kind to you and are willing to help. And it's also important to like allow things to like sometimes fall by the wayside. Like for example, tonight, I am not doing my laundry. I have to do my laundry. It's not getting done tonight, and I'll tell you that for free. So it's just being kind to yourself and having others be kind to you really does go a long way. Kindness, just generally, especially when you're trying to balance, a creative lifestyle with a professional lifestyle, and still trying to balance like that family aspect of it. So I'm glad that you have your wife to support you. That's really lovely.
And the last question I'd like to close it out with, just to give you the final word on anything you want to throw in. Joan, how do you see yourself and the work that you do as a writer?
Yeah. So for me personally, all I hope that, I hope readers learn from my books, but the most important thing I hope that they take out of it is a massive amount of fun. I want readers to have an absolutely great time reading my books. I want them to be like laughing out loud for the majority of it and just really enjoying like the adventure they go on. I want them to be able to escape like the stresses of day-to-day life, whether they be, 8 years old or 80 years old, and just kind of immerse themselves in a story. Because that's what books for me were. That's what I read as a kid. That's what books were for me when I was a child. So I just hope to be able to do that with kids today. And even adult readers, I've had, 60-year-old readers come to me at book signings and say that they really enjoyed reading it and had a great time and finished it in a day. And that's just been such a great compliment. It's just like being able to give people like a small escape into something fun.
Thank you. That was an interview with author Joan Reardon. Her new book, Dad Rock Dragon Quest, is available now. You can learn more about Joan and her work at writingreardon.com. As we discussed in the interview, Joan is also a lawyer, and after our recording, she brought to my attention a rise in fraudulent emails targeting independent authors. For any writers that have received unsolicited emails that seem too good to be true, or have legal questions regarding potential scam offers from people claiming to be publicists, please reach out through the email or on the website listed in the episode description. Next, we'll be looking at notable releases out this week. But first, if you appreciate the work being done with the Book Faire podcast, there are a few ways to show your support. First, you can like, comment, favorite, subscribe, or follow the podcast wherever you are currently listening to help push it out to new listeners. Second, you can follow the podcast on Blue Sky at BookFairPod. You can also go to patreon.com/thebookfair to find episodes posted early as well as links to news sources used throughout the show. Lastly, the best way to show your support for the Book Faire podcast is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Now, on with the show. Next, let's take a look at some new releases, beginning with The Last Tiger by Brad and Julia Reiw. Sibling debut authors Brad and Julia Reiw weave Korean folklore and history with intimate, familial recollections in this magic-infused tale of star-crossed teens fighting for their forbidden love. Both Lee Seung and Choi Eun-ji yearn for freedom. Seung from his duties serving the noble Kois, and Eun-ji from her family's grandiose yet restrictive lifestyle in the Dragon Empire. Following the teens' chance encounter, they strike a deal. Eun-ji will tutor Seung, who harbors a desire to master ancient key magic in preparation for the Adachi Training Academy entrance exam, while Seung will keep Eun-ji's unchaperoned outings a secret and help her improve her escape techniques. Their rendezvous foster a budding romance until a tiger, a symbol of the tiger colonies thought extinct by the colonizing Dragon Empire, suddenly appears. Soon Seung and Eun-ji find themselves on opposite sides of a cultural divide, their love further complicated by the arrival of a charming princeling suitor vying for Eun-ji's affection. This grounded fantasy, inspired by the author's grandparents' love story, incorporates excerpts of correspondence from their grandmother and grandfather. Expansive world building draws on historical tensions during Japan's occupation of Korea. Author's notes provide additional context, and this book is recommended for ages 12 and up. Next up is Masks by Brian Nathanson and Margaret Reiw, illustrated by Beck Kurbick. Young, green-skinned monster Poe and her found family of fellow creatures Rice and Shelley live in an abandoned building to stay hidden from the human monster hunting organization, the Knights of the Night. When the youth's hideout is scheduled to be demolished, however, they're forced to vacate. On Halloween night, they set out to find a rumored place called the Haven. And though they hope to remain concealed among the costumed revelers celebrating the holiday, they could still be discovered at any moment. After bespectacled, brown-skinned human Vaughn gains the monster's trust, he promises to aid them on their quest. Using a trio of fantastical creatures as a proxy, Nathanson and debut author Reiw examine the plight of dangers faced by marginalized individuals in contemporary society. Kubrick utilizes thin line art and a bold color palette to render the sweet-dispositioned protagonists of this suspenseful graphic novel, which plumbs sophisticated themes across an entertaining and visually playful adventure. This book is recommended for ages 10 and up. And lastly for this week, Mastery of Monsters by Liselle Sambury. 17-year-old August Black doesn't believe that her older brother Jules would abandon her. Yet all she has of her mysteriously vanished sibling is the cryptic note he left behind in his university dorm room in Kingston, Canada, warning her of dangerous monsters. August's investigation into his disappearance leads her to shapeshifter Virgil Hawthorne, one of the monsters Jules cautioned her against. As part of a magical underground organization called the Learners' Society, Virgil must bond with a human master so that he may retain his humanity while in his monstrous form, or risk imprisonment by the institution's elites. Though August agrees to bond with Virgil in exchange for his help in finding Jules, their tenuous alliance sees August navigating the group's complex rules and enigmatic followers, as well as a brutal competition for permanent membership. August's quick-witted narration tackles the society's sinister ideals head-on, while confident prose by author Sambury skillfully explores nuanced examinations of parental pressure and neglect, prejudice, systemic violence, and unjust power dynamics. Propulsive pacing, layered lore, and high emotional stakes further distinguish this dark academia series opener. This book is recommended for ages 14 and up. Finally, let's take a look at an ongoing story still developing in South Carolina. Back in January of this year, a lawsuit was filed on behalf of the South Carolina NAACP challenging a provision in the state's education funding that has been in effect since 2021. This law prohibits public funding to be used to teach that one race or sex is inherently superior to another, or that people are inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive due to their identity. The wording of these guidelines is similar to right-wing talking points that schools are teaching radical gender, sexual, or racial ideology, and that students should feel bad for being white. South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson puts it very bluntly, saying, "Our schools are supposed to be places of learning and collaboration, not indoctrination into woke ideologies that assign blame or condemnation based on race or sex." In 2024, the South Carolina Department of Education cited the rule in the removal of the AP African Studies course from the state's curriculum. The lawsuit is currently moving through the court process, and opponents of the law have made their voices heard that this is blatant erasure of American history and violates the First Amendment. There currently stands a coalition of attorneys general from 17 states that argue in favor of the law. Those states are Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Louisiana, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Texas, Utah, and West Virginia. This case is currently ongoing and the story is still developing. To read more about the story, please check out patreon.com/thebookfair to find the links used in this article. Following is completely free and no posts are locked behind any kind of payment. And this will conclude another episode of the Book Fair podcast. Summer classes are still underway and are very demanding for college students like myself, which is why this is another shorter episode. Thank you anyway for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.